Well, I know I may be diving much more deeply into some abstruse theological conversation discussions, but at the same time, I think as Christians, we need to really think through these things, especially when we talk about war, because Jesus said in the end times there would be a multiplication of wars, and we're certainly seeing multiplication of warfare around the world. It's interesting. People thought that when the Soviet Union collapsed, that would be an end of warfare, and we have more wars since the fall of communism than we had before. It's a crazy thought to think that in some ways, the United States and Russia were keeping their proxies at bay. And now there's no longer any restraints, and even corrupt players like Iran or Qatar can easily fund and support their proxy wars around the world. So part of the discussion comes, is it wrong to use self-defense? And there are some people, some Christians who are pacifists. They believe that you should never do anything that protects yourself from the harm from other people. And I think that as an individual, I may decide that I'm not going to take or harm somebody else if they're going to harm me. But I have to tell you, I think it would be ungodly for me to ignore somebody else being harmed. And that's why when we talk about the issue of self-defense, it oftentimes, if somebody were to basically say there was a home invasion robbery at my house, and there was a potential of my wife or my puppy being injured, would I use the weapons that I do possess to protect my wife and anybody else that was in my home? I think it would be a dereliction of my duty as a husband, a father, a man, and even in some sense as a pastor, to simply do nothing. And that's why even within our church, we have a fairly large contingency of security people, and most of them, quite honestly, are armed and know how to use their weapons. And they're there for a very real reason. We have paid security on staff, because we don't want, first of all, we want the deterrence of seeing that we're not a soft target. But secondly, we don't want unnecessary loss of life. And so if someone was to try to do something, hopefully we would be able to negate that threat, neutralize that threat before somebody was life was lost, as we saw in the Covenant School in Nashville and other places around the country. So I understand the pacifist point of view, and I'm not going to judge you. You have to follow your own conscience. But I don't think that these things are always all wrong, nor do I think that war is always wrong, because we find that the church very early, about 1,000 years ago, there was a development really by Thomas Aquinas of what we call the principles of a just war. And Aquinas laid out some very basic things. He said that we need to be able to answer questions whether or not a war should be waged. That secondly, can it be justified if we do wage it? And then he said there are conditions that really do justify war. Number one, it has to be for a just cause. Now, what is a just cause? Well, being invaded by an outsider that seeks to kill and destroy, plunder and pillage is a just cause. And at the same time, that's the reason why we have police forces, but that's also why nations have military forces. Hopefully they're self-defense forces. That's why we even changed in our country. We used to call the Department of War, and our founding fathers actually named the Defense Department. We changed it to the Department of Defense. And the irony is, when we were the Department of War, we had very few wars. When we became the Department of Defense, now we have more wars than we can even keep track of. So crazy how the name game goes on. But the whole point is, if somebody is invading for the purpose of increasing wealth and power, then that's an unjust reason for war. If we are threatened and we protect ourselves, that's what makes for a just war. Secondly, Aquinas reasoned that war has to be something that's clearly declared and controlled. And here again is what's troubling to me about a lot of things that we're doing, that most of our conflicts, we would call them proxy wars. We're basically paying and supporting the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. We're doing much the same in Israel today. And I personally believe that Israel has every right to do what they're doing, and hopefully they're staying within the rules, if you will, and there are rules actually. But self-defense is justifiable, but it needs to be something that's clearly declared and it's operated in a controlled way, that there's a certain proper authority that keeps people from doing unnecessary harm and violence, particularly the idea that we don't seek personal revenge, we don't prey on the innocents. And this is really an issue that becomes very, very complicated, because in many of our wars, we could raise the question, for example, during World War II, where there was firebombing of people like cities like Hamburg and Dresden, which were not military sites, and yet hundreds of thousands of German people were burned to death. The same thing happened in Tokyo before the bomb was dropped, and probably 100,000 Japanese died in the firebombing of Tokyo, and again with the dropping of the nuclear weapon. Now, the argument goes back and forth. We had to take lives in order to save lives, and I understand that, but listening to people who were involved in some of those things, you can tell this very day they're deeply conflicted over that, because they realize that they were really probably doing things they didn't have to do. Personally, I think to kill innocents just to be able to shorten the war is short-sighted. You give up all your moral authority for what you're doing. But I understand the arguments. You may strongly disagree. I mean, that's certainly your choice. But I think that the whole purpose behind a war, if we're involved, is to promote good and to avoid evil as much as possible, and seeking to fight a war to end wars so that there can be peace and there can be justice. I mean, our involvement in World War II is probably as close as we've ever come to the idea of a just war. Maybe the War of 1812, when the British invaded. Those things were things that we didn't ask for. They were brought to our shores, and we were, fortunately, in both cases, were able to be victorious, and brought a time of peace, security, and stability, that there was a promotion of greater good and less evil in the world. And then, of course, Aquinas said that the war must be a last resort. It's something that we have attempted to resolve in every way we can, and as a result, the war was brought to us. We didn't bring it to them. And I think, again, when you look at what happened with Hamas invading Israel, Israel has been working for a long time to try to bring peace. I think it's the whole, even when President Obama was saying, referring to those areas as occupied territories, Israel hasn't occupied Palestine or the Gaza region since 2006. They pulled all of their troops, all of their people out, gave it completely to them, and enabled them to establish their own communities, their own nationhoods. They don't want a two-state solution, which again is some of this verbiage out there, a two-state solution. Palestine, Gaza, the Hamas have rejected a two-state solution every single time it's been attempted. So when Israel is invaded, and the people who invaded says we're going to keep on doing it again and again and again until Israel is completely wiped off the map, then I think that's a just response on their behalf. And I can't imagine people who say, well, they should just, let the Palestinians keep on coming and killing innocent women and children with a savagery that's incomprehensible. So I think that happens. But he said at the same time that war should be fought proportionally, that we should make every effort to avoid unnecessary casualties, and that we focus on going after military targets and not civilian targets. Oftentimes they talk about collateral damage, which implies that it was unintentional and it happened. But sometimes in war, harming civilians, much like is happening in the Ukraine and Russia war, is intentional and should be something that's dealt with as war crimes. And finally, what Aquinas said is the good which comes up that conflict should be greater than the evil which led to the war in the first place. So I think if you look at it honestly and historically, you'll find that there have been some wars that have been fought for good reasons, beginning, first of all, out of self-defense, and secondly, to bring an end to evil that's in the world. But the vast majority of wars that have taken place in the world have not been fought for good reasons and were not justifiable. And I think that that's something we need to own. It seems that our human nature likes these wars, and I don't understand. I can only say that that's true of people who have never been touched by them or have no true awareness of how evil they are. Well, enough of those topics. I'm sorry if you aren't interested or these are boring. I hope they're at least thoughtful, even if that means troubling you enough to think about them, because I think we have to look at what's going on in our world and realize what is the biblical basis of, and how should I respond? I can't just take this apathetic view of saying, well, that's the world, it's not my problem. No, it is your problem. It is all of our problems, and it's our treasure and our children who are being victimized by these evil players that are in the world. Well, tomorrow we'll move on to another point. God bless you and go in His grace.